Hello, I'm Isabella Rausch, and this is my final presentation for Ceramics of East Asia. The article that I will be analyzing today is Kim Woo-rim's Fragrance of Flowers in a Scholar's Studio. Kim Woo-rim is a Korean art historian who studied Western painting at Seoul National University before acquiring his PhD in art history from Hongik University. From 1998, he worked as a curator at the National Museum in Seoul and was recently promoted, becoming the director of the National Museum in Chuncheon. I was actually unable to find much information on this author myself, so thank you, Dr. Stiller, for your help in getting this information. This photo comes from a recent newspaper article, which I've noted in the bibliography, but it is in Korean. I was able to discover other articles of his on my own, and this, paired with the information we have here, really adds to his credibility and my overall trust in him when discussing Korean art. The main purpose of this paper is to define the idea of Munbong Chongwon, which is an intentional sort of collecting in Joseon, and use it to describe the evolution of new aesthetics within Korean ceramics and focusing specifically on floral motifs. The photo I've included is an example of a stationary item using floral motifs. It is a cylindrical brush container with peonies. While describing Munbong Chongwon and giving examples of it, the author describes this trend in the different ways that it was experienced. To those who pursued Confucian ideals, it was a way to put those beliefs into practice. And for the middle class, it was a way to show high levels of sophistication and be seen as having an advanced cultural perspective. As the paper progresses, there's more of a focus specifically on floral motifs and their symbolic meanings. As far as methodology goes, Woo-rim basically follows the same kind of format that I described with the main statement of the article. He goes in depth about what Munbong Chongwon is and follows a timeline describing the growth of its popularity, describes what kinds of items were collected, and then explains why people were collecting these things. He provides many photo examples of the kinds of objects that would be collected and focuses largely on stationary items. He also references some poems, records, and other writings from this time period. On this slide, I've included a stationary item that isn't specifically focused on in the article, but I really like it, and I think it shows more variety in the kinds of items that could be considered part of Munbong Chongwon. This item is a mountain-shaped brush holder, and it's got a little picture of a landscape with a house on it. To begin with terminology, we have Munbong Chongwon, which Woo-rim describes as an appreciation of pure objects in a scholar's studio. This idea evolves throughout the article to essentially mean objects that one collects to fit a certain aesthetic that makes them seem cool. Jungin is a word for middle-class professionals. And maybe this one is a well-known word, but I'd never heard it. So literati is a word for educated people interested in literature. Next, we have sarangbang, which is a room specifically for men that acted as a study and reception room. This was like an office, and it housed many of the items associated with Munbong Chongwon. This is also where we'd find the san, which is a table for reading books, and the san was flat. And it's also where we'd find the gyeongsang, which is a table for reading Buddhist scriptures, which had upturned edges like a scroll. These desks would sit next to the stationary chests, which would house the stationary items that were collected, like the 4 treasures of the study: paper, brush, ink stick, and ink stone, along with other objects. And one of those other objects is the tokmei byung, which is pictured on this side and is a type on this slide and is a type of jar that has a trapezoidal body and a wide mouth that was used for holding brushes or flowers. Then there's Heite, which is a mythical animal, kind of like a lion. And finally, Yun Hui Mai, which is an artificial plum blossom that is sculpted out of beeswax. So starting off the article, we have a description of the spread of Munbong Chongwon in Korea. In the late 18th, early 19th century, lots of imported ceramics made their way into Joseon, and they made their way into the new leisure activities of the literati. Some of these activities included drinking tea, looking at paintings, calligraphy, and collecting different things like potted plants, books, stationery items, and various antiquities. This photo shows an example of one of the popular stationery items, a quadrilateral water dropper. As we discussed before, the collection and admiration of these things was called Munbong Chongwon. The author describes how this idea grew out of the appreciation of art from the mid-Goryeo period and grew during the reign of King Sukjong when stationery items were admired in a similar fashion to art and calligraphy. In the 18th century, the trend of Munbong Chongwon caught the attention of powerful families and scholars, and this caused a rise in popularity, which caused new markets to pop up, specifically selling books and antiquities. Finally, in the 19th century, the trend expanded enough to include the middle class. Now we have a description of some of the objects more commonly found in blue and white porcelain stationery. There were a couple kinds of jars, an octagonal style used to hold rolls of paper, and a cylindrical style used to store brushes. To emphasize use over style, they were often simply decorated with lots of blank space. This style is found throughout a majority of these stationary objects, including quadrilateral water droppers. Many common themes for decor on these items included the landscape, bamboo, plum blossoms, flowering plants, unusually shaped rocks, waves, and Chinese characters. Water droppers were also commonly egg-shaped and had an oval body with a flat base. Another popular item was the tokmei byung, which was the trapezoidal jar used for brushes of flowers, and its name means bottle shaped like a rice cake mallet. As time went on, more densely decorated items became popular, and some were made to look like plants, animals like hei, houses, and more. On this slide is an example of a shaped water dropper, and this one is shaped like a fish. And it became that some of these objects began to value decoration over function, which reflected the evolution of Munbong Chongwon's popularity, moving from Confucianist ideals towards those that were just trying to prove their status. The author then goes on to describe instances in which Junggin professionals were adopting Munbong Chongwon, citing paintings and records. One of the paintings that he cites is pictured on the right side of this slide and depicts an example of a sarangbang. One of the stories he describes is one of a man who spent all of his family fortune on antiquities. The man sat alone with no furniture, smelling the scent of Chinese ink, and was supposedly satisfied with his purchases, claiming that he wasn't bothered by the cold or hunger. The sarangbang was used for various purposes in the late Joseon period. It was used for scholarship, appreciating collections, and for competitively displaying one's collection. Different paintings of this period also focus on various items typical of Munbong Chongwon, such as still lifes of flowers, stationery items, and books. These items are also seen depicted on various blue and white objects of the late Joseon dynasty. Within the article, many examples of jars are shown with potted plants on their side. You can see this on the image within the slide, and this image actually comes from the article. What's important to note is that these plants are potted, which differentiates them from some of the floral themes that we've discussed previously in class that just have floating floral scrolls. Finally, the article ends with some examples of contemporary writing that focused on potted plants and banana trees and analyzes the different flowers favored by the literati. The first writing describes the symbolism of various flowers, for example, describing peonies as a symbol of wealth and prosperity. Woodin then describes the ways in which florals are depicted on various ceramics, noting that floral motifs grouped together on a small vessel convey the impression of a small flower garden inside a room. Lastly, there is a small section on artificial plum blossoms called Yunhui Mai, which are then pictured within blue and white vessels, and I've included one of these photos on this slide. The article is closed with the statement, "The popularization, stylization, and conformity of the motifs on these vessels signaled the emergence of new aesthetics for ceramics in the upcoming modern industrial society." So, to me, the main statement or argument was a bit fuzzy throughout the article. There were some main themes, but they seemed to kind of evolve throughout the article and they were never clearly stated. And then at the very end of the article is that overarching statement that I wasn't even sure was the thesis because it felt so loosely touched on throughout the article. It almost felt as though this was two articles mashed together, like one about Moonbong Chongwon and then one about the evolution of the floral motifs in the realm of Korean ceramics. Although all of the information was really interesting, I would have liked to have a more structured experience to clarify my understanding of the material. I titled each slide the way that each section of the reading was titled. So if you feel confused about some of the topics included on each slide, you are not alone. I felt like some of the information just felt jumbled and it was hard to make connections between them because they felt so disorganized. And there were also some ideas that felt really important that weren't elaborated on at all, like how stationary items specifically gained popularity, like how they became just as popular as like looking at art. That wasn't really elaborated on. And I chose this article because I love stationery and I collect it myself. So for just absorbing a ton of information on some stationery history, it was great. I included these house-shaped water droppers because I personally collect house-shaped items and I just think they're really lovely. I loved reading about everything that was talked about from the usage to the symbolism, and I would definitely recommend reading it if you also enjoy stationery. However, from an art historical perspective, it just doesn't flow well and was really confusing to follow. And then here's my bibliography, which mainly cites where I found the photos that I used in this presentation.